My name's Richard Dawkins. I'm one of guys like you. I'm a business person. And I'm here tonight to try and represent you as a Michael Parkinson. And that's a very big problem because, as you will hear immediately he opens his mouth, he's Irish. So he can talk. I warn you now. So we're on a very strict timetable and we'll try and keep him on course. So, John, it is obvious that you are from Northern Ireland as soon as you open your mouth. Now, that cannot have been an easy place to have grown up in.
Well, it was an interesting place to grow up in. I'm old, of course, now. And so I left Ireland to come to England just as the so-called Troubles were starting. But my memories of home are very positive in the sense that in a country that has a rather sad reputation for sectarianism, my parents were Christian without being sectarian, which is very unusual. They employed people from both sides of the religious community and got bombed for it. So they took a principled stand on the idea that all human beings are equal. And I grew up with that delivered me from so much of the sectarian baggage that many of my contemporaries had. My parents were also very unusual in that they allowed me to think. And our home was full of stimulus. As I said, they were Christian, but I grew up with a Christianity that was open-ended, that was questioning, that was intellectually curious. And so they encouraged me to explore all kinds of things, and I owe them an enormous debt. So in a sense, I was shielded from a lot of the trouble. And then, of course, I left the country, Richard.
Now, John, as you know, I come from Lloyd's of London. That's insurance. The idea of an evening with an insurance man and a mathematician, it's not really exciting. I mean,
well, we could do some creative accounting.
Well, we have. I'm sure there are people in this room that do, but we will leave that alone. Now, John, I can assure you no one grows up thinking I'm going to go into the insurance industry. As you grew up, did you think mathematics is all I'm interested in? Or were there, as a little boy, were there other interests that fueled John Lennox?
Well, I always enjoyed arithmetic, and I probably was a pretty sorry, creepy little boy who asked for extra homework all the time. And I found arithmetic easy, but I very rapidly developed an interest in languages. It has to do with teaching. I had some brilliant teachers and some that I'd rather forget. And interest in languages. And I suppose a kind of leitmotif for life has been that pure mathematics that I do is the most compressed language, in one sense the purest of all languages, though I'm sure people will disagree with that. So you have a spectrum of language from pure mathematics to natural languages to computer languages and so on. And that idea of the way in which we can approach the universe and reduce it to number, law, and so on always fascinated me. And it led to my interest widening out like a cone from the mathematical describability of the universe to where mathematics sits in science. Where does science fit in the big picture? And so on. So I was encouraged and stimulated by my parents and others from a very young age to read widely and ask the big questions. But I went through all kinds of phases. I wanted to be an electrical engineer because I became a radio amateur at the age of about 13 and discovered that I could learn languages by radio because we couldn't afford the travel. So I was very fortunate that way and was able to learn French and German to speak them fairly fluently, while before I got to O-level even. So my hobby of electronics proved to be the gateway to, I didn't know it at the time, to a very important part of my life, which is allowing the insights of other cultures to educate me. So there was that. So I wanted to be an electrical engineer. And one day my headmaster came to me and in his lugubrious voice, he said, "Lennox, would you like to go to Cambridge?" And I said, "I don't know." "Would that be a good idea?" Well, he said, I think it would. I was there in 1915. And I thought, wow. Would you like to go? Because if you want to go, the only subject you can do to get in is mathematics, because we don't have the teaching. So I consulted some friends, and thankfully, I got into Cambridge, and that was a very big step forward. So lots of interests that I took up. I didn't study languages because I'd had such a good teacher. I could speak some of them by the time I was 16 or 17. And of course, I hadn't the sense to see that the important thing is not that, but the literature. But then I thought I can fill that in a little bit later. So I went for the science.
Okay, well, we'll come back to Cambridge in a moment. But as my job is to try and bring out the man this evening, let me ask you whether you've got hobbies now.
Oh,
so
yes.
we know that you speak a lot and you write a lot, but what are your hobbies today?
Well, I still love languages and reading and speaking and so on. I've just been lecturing in Germany last week. But also I have got a telescope in my garden, and I'm delighted we have an astrophysicist with us at the table tonight. And just enjoy going out at night and looking at Andromeda and reminding myself of how vast the universe is and how tiny I am and how little I know. And it's the sheer glory of what you see, looking at the Orion Nebula and so on. I just wish we could remove some of the cloud cover at times. And I like bird watching, actually. Things to do with optical instruments, I suppose you could put it together. I'm fond of, and I do a little bit of walking. But my wife and I share a love for wildlife, so we like to go places where there's lots of it to be seen.
All right, well, let's go back to This Is Your Life. So 1962, Professor John Lennox, no, you weren't
No,
there.
I was
John
not.
Lennox, you toggle off to Cambridge University, and immediately, I'm sure you came across one C.S. Lewis,
Yes,
who
I
must
did.
have still been there at the time.
Yes, I did.
Did you hear him?
I did, yes.
What was
well,
he
you
like?
see, I've always believed that literature is very important in whatever language it's read. So the maths department, you've all heard of Mill Lane in Cambridge, where Crick and Watson rushed into the pub and said they discovered the secret of life. Well, the maths department was on one side in an awful building that had been a printing press. And on the other side were the lecture rooms used by the English faculty. So when the maths became boring, but you didn't hear that, I would sneak across the room where Lewis was in the very final series of his lectures. I didn't know he was very ill. He died the following year. But I have such a vivid memory of him lecturing. There are double doors like that. And exactly on the hour, he'd come freezing cold weather, big burly man, a little bit bigger than me, I think. And he had a coat on and a scarf on and a hat on. And he would start lecturing the moment he burst through the door. And he would slowly unwind his scarf and take over his hat and fold up his coat. And by the time he'd done that, you'd had 5 minutes of a word-perfect, brilliant lecture. And then the fun was that he reversed the process at the end of the lecture. He kept lecturing as he put on his hat, wound up his scarf, put on his coat, and the very last words were delivered as he went through the door. No time for Q&A.
Well, let's keep you in Cambridge. You, I think, at that stage, had already got a view that belief in science and belief in God were actually compatible. Mm-hmm. Now, was that challenged while you were at Cambridge? I'm guessing the answer is yes. And how did you handle that challenge?
Well, it's been challenged all of my life, actually. But I think it was an amusing challenge that really became the compass bearing. It was one of the reasons I'm here tonight. I had only been there about a week when a fellow student at dinner, rather too loudly for my liking, asked me if I believed in God. And then he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot you're Irish." I should never have asked you that question. I do apologize because, listen, all you Irish believe in God and you fight about it. Now, of course, I'd heard that before, but something happened. I thought, I've got a real opportunity now. I'd never really met any serious atheists. I mean, in Ireland you meet Protestant atheists and Catholic atheists, but you never meet serious atheists. And I thought, being now at Cambridge, what I should do, could he be right? After all, my parents were believers and their parents, and the whole thing boils down to Irish genetics. So what do you do about it? Well, you read a lot, but I thought, here's the opportunity to befriend people that don't share your worldview. And I made a deliberate step in my first week. I looked around the mathematicians and decided on a person who probably never been to church. He turned out to be an agnostic, and the friendship grew. And I think, Richard, really, I would say that I've been doing that ever since. That is, exposing what I believe and listening to other people what they believe. And that interest grew as I began to discuss with people. And I've learned German, and I was told after I'd finished my doctorate that it'd be a good idea to spend a couple of years in Germany. So I went there, and that opened up the way to go particularly to the German Democratic Republic. And I found that utterly fascinating, because now I could begin to see the effect of atheist philosophy in society as a whole. And then when the wall fell, to cut a long story short, and I helped to knock it down, just in a gentle way, but nevertheless, I've got my piece of wall at home, I started traveling to Russia, because for many years my salary was so low as a university lecturer in Cardiff that I had to supplement it. So I said to my colleagues, you guys seem to have a way of earning extra cash. How do you do it? Oh, they said, it's very simple. We translate Russian. Oh, I said, do you really? How do you do that? Well, they said, go and buy yourself a mathematical dictionary of Russian and offer your services to the American Math Society. So I did, and learned it on the hoof, little knowing that this was going to be the key to one of the most fascinating periods of my life. Because from 1989 to about 6 years ago, I traveled regularly, particularly to Siberia, and I always got a two-way ticket. It was wonderful. Meeting dissidents, meeting fascinating people, and again, discussing with them my worldview, their worldview, and so on. So in a sense, my life has been constantly allowing that challenge to occur. I've never stopped. And that's one of the reasons I find it so interesting coming to a situation like this evening. I'm fascinated by your questions. So that'll give you a little bit of an insight into some of what makes me tick. It's that curiosity to listen. Why do you think what you think? And how has your environment and culture shaped that? And let's discuss these notions. And I suppose coming from the mathematical perspective, where mathematics is understood by everybody to be a universal language that transcends the individual, it's very interesting then to discuss the big ideas where there are different opinions, and not everybody shares the same view of the answers to those big questions. So I've been enormously privileged to be allowed to do that. And in recent years, as some of you know, to debate some of the leading atheists in the world, like Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, sadly departed, and Peter Singer, and so on.
Now, John, we know that you do actually travel around the world. You're speaking as you go. And the last decade has been a really fascinating one, because on one side, particularly in Europe, we've seen a decline in the number of people attending church. And yet, apparently, the number of people who would say that they are Bible-based Christians around the world has dramatically risen. And as an example, I'll give you China, which I understand has risen from 15 million Christian believers to 70 to 80 million in simply the last decade. And it's not the only area that that's occurred. As you travel, do you find there is an increased interest in people questioning Christianity?
Put like that, the answer is an unqualified yes. And it's an interesting way to put the question, because when they did the BBC survey a few years ago on belief in Britain, they asked, what is the biggest reason that you would give for leaving the church? Number one answer by far was this: they don't answer our questions. And what you were saying is there an interest in questioning? There is a vast interest in questioning. I've just been in the United States. I don't think I had an audience less than 1,000 in the universities. Young people are asking questions to such an extent they often won't let me lecture. And they'll come and say, look, we'll choose a theme, like the theme tonight, as science buried God, but we won't tell you the questions. And from the word go, we're going to go around the university for 3 or 4 weeks before you come. We're going to get a professor, usually holding an opposite opinion to mine, and we're going to collect the question, give them to him, you're not going to know them, and he's going to grill you. And then we're going to grill you. And the interest is just marvelous. I've been in Australia and South Africa, and for me, it was almost unprecedented, the response. There is enormous interest in thinking, because I think that in our generation, which has been, I would say, brainwashed into thinking that naturalism is the default position, there are a lot of people who are beginning to question that and say, is this all there is? Is it really true that we're simply meaningless, ultimately, objects thrown into being by the random permutations of a blind universe, subject to the laws of nature, wherever they came from? And people genuinely want to know. And in the business world, and you may think it's curious, a mathematician addressing you, but I actually teach in the business school. And what I do there is I use ancient literature to stimulate questions on ethics and leadership. It's absolutely fascinating stuff. And I find that when people reach a certain level, I had the sort of second level of IBM not long ago, and one man gave me a really interestingly rough time. He was tenacious and he was very bright. And after he'd fired his machine gun for about 20 minutes and everybody else had just listened to this interchange, he then said, I'm sorry, but he said, I need to know. I said, what do you need to know? He said, you know, I had this stuff rammed down my throat when I was at school and I gave it up. But now, he said, I've made it. I've got the toys. I'm at the top. And I'm starting to ask these questions again. And I just want to know if you're real, hence the pressure. I'm sorry. And I meet that again and again.